J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity Podcast. I'm J. Warner Wallace, and today, as my special guest, the guy that is responsible for any of the success that we've had in this ministry in the last 10 years, my dear brother Frank Turek. And I've got you on the show, Frank, for a specific reason. You've got a re-release of a book that was kind of foundational for you in your ministry. As a matter of fact, foundational in more ways than one. And I know you have a huge media presence in terms of the Christian apologetics world. But sometimes I'm always surprised that when someone listens to one podcast, they may not listen to all the others. So just as a way of background, would you just kind of introduce how this issue really was what urged and kind of not urged, but put you in a position where you decided to do what you do now full time when before this you weren't. Can you just that story is very compelling. Would you just briefly cover that for us?
Sure. When I moved here to Charlotte to attend seminary, my wife and I had 3 kids under the age of 5, so we needed to have a job to make money to go to school. So I started doing training for companies like leadership training, sales training, team building, customer service, that kind of stuff. I had a background in training in the Navy, so I, through God's help, because it was tough the first few years, but we started to get enough clients to make a decent living. And I'm going to seminary while I'm doing this, and I wrote a book called Correct, Not Politically Correct, and it was about same-sex marriage at the time, originally written in 2008. In 2011, I'm doing work for Cisco, the computer people out of San Jose, and also Bank of America. And one day when I'm doing some leadership training for Cisco, I get a text from a friend of mine who hired me there. He's a Christian guy, and he said, "Hey, when does your event end?" I said, "It ends about 5 o'clock." So he came over to the event at 4 o'clock, sat through the last hour of the presentation, and one lady came up to me, she was from India, it's an international company. She said, "Wow, that was the best leadership course I've ever had." And Steve is standing right next to me, and anyway, Steve goes, "We got to go in another room to talk." And I could tell he was upset about something. I said, "What's up, Steve?" He goes, "I got to fire you." I go, "Why?" He said, "Because someone in your class Googled your name and figured out you wrote this book against same-sex marriage." And so he called the HR director and said, "You can't work here because I'm against same-sex marriage." And I thought, what does that have to do with me doing leadership training for you? And keep in mind, this is 2011. This is long before the Supreme Court imposed it on all the nation. And anyway, I said, "Okay, fine, you got to fire me." He didn't want to do it. He's a Christian, but he said that HR director said you needed to go. In the name of inclusion, tolerance, and diversity, I needed to be fired and not tolerated because I had a diverse view. In any event, I'd learned that John Chambers, who at the time was the president of Cisco, was also in 2008 on the Elect McCain Commission in California. He headed it. And so I wrote John Chambers a letter. I FedExed it to him. I said, "Mr. Chambers, I'm a veteran of the United States Navy. For the past several years, I've been doing training in your company, and I was fired because of my view on same-sex marriage, even though that was never brought up in any of the training. And I said, I appreciate your support for Senator John McCain in the last election. Are you aware that Senator McCain has the same position on same-sex marriage that I do? Are you qualified to be working at Cisco?" And so I got a phone call that day after the letter got there, and this attorney got on and said, "Hey, what do you want?" I said, "I don't want anything other than you call the dogs off other Christians. I mean, you claim to be a company that's inclusive, tolerant, and diverse, and I have a different position on a political issue, and I can't work there? How does that make any sense?" And the attorney said, "Well, we could set you up to talk to a lady in our company that handles inclusion, tolerance, and diversity issues." I said, "Fine, let's do it." So we scheduled a phone call, and our mutual friend Mike Adams was in the room. We happened to be at Summit at the time when we had this call with this lady by the name of Marilyn Nagel. And the call, Jim, did not go well. I kept asking her questions like, what does inclusion mean? What does intolerance mean? What does diversity mean? How are you excluding me for not tolerating me for having a diverse view? Well, she could give me no answer that wasn't contradictory. And so I turned to Mike. I said, Mike, we got to go public with this. This is ridiculous. if we don't stand up, they're going to keep doing this to people. So we did. Mike wrote the first column called The Cisco Kid. And then I wrote a column called Sex at Work. By the way, friends, do not Google that. Do not Google sex at work. It'll take you right to Harvey Weinstein's website. No, I mean, get the book, Correct Not Politically Correct, about same-sex marriage and transgenderism, because I have actually that column that I wrote in the book, which explains what happened. And
right.
So in 2017 or 16, right after the Supreme Court decision, I updated this book again to reflect that new development. And then just this year, 2023, I updated it again to reflect all the new developments with regard to transgenderism. So the new book is called Correct Not Politically Correct, about same-sex marriage and transgenderism. And as you know, Jim, there's no Bible verses in this book. This is a natural law, common sense medical case that shows that both same-sex marriage and transgenderism are not only they're not good for individuals, they're not good for society. So that's kind of the background of the whole thing.
And I really appreciate that approach, actually, because, that's something that was very powerful for me as an atheist at 35. I needed to know, was there some way to make the case for this that wasn't so utterly dependent on some verse in the New Testament? Mm-hmm. That sounds crazy when it comes to Jesus, but it's actually possible to do. And this is another one of those areas where I don't think many people are going to give you time. Now, look, there's so much to cover here, and we only have, this 1/2 hour in which to work. So I want to get right to it. I think that some of the things I see as a parent and as a grandparent, I think are probably on the mind of a lot of Christians who maybe don't feel themselves or necessarily in the fight nationally, but they're in the fight in their own homes. They're
right.
At least they're in the, not the fight, but the concern that they have for their own family. So I want to focus, if you don't mind, at least initially, on the second half of your book, that last part about transgenderism, because I think it's such a huge issue. And here's what I want to ask you. Why do you think, I think we see it, but why do you think that we're at a time in history where this movement could blossom the way it has, while we could be where we are, with so many people claiming that this is part of their identity now, when it was never the case in the past? Why do you think this is the window in which this is happening?
Social media. It's social media driven almost completely now. In fact, gender dysphoria, true gender dysphoria, affected 1 out of every 10,000 men, say, a decade ago. Now, in some locations, 30% of the girls are claiming to be trans. Now, how did this happen? And Abigail Shrier, who wrote the seminal book, The Transgender, or Irreversible Damage, how the transgender craze is affecting or seducing our daughters, she says it's almost completely social media driven. She's gone to some schools, girls' schools, where 40% of the girls are claiming to be trans. And so it's driven almost completely by that, because young girls are feeling out of place in their bodies, and they think this is going to be the solution, to claim to be trans. Now, what we need to tell people is that adolescence is one big transition. It's a transition from being a child to being an adult. So it's normal to feel odd. It's normal to feel odd when you're going through puberty. So we need to point out that initially, and there's several other things we can talk about.
Well, that's a good point. Now, what do you say to somebody, and this is what I've made this same kind of claim to people on the other side of this issue, who will push back and say, well, no, it's not that this is this was always a phenomenon, but the culture, the repressive Christian-dominated worldview culture of America kind of kept a lid on what was really happening all along. And now that lid is kind of coming off, we're seeing, what they would say is that we're seeing the same percentages that have always existed. They're just now coming to the top because there's nothing to repress them.
Well, actually, it's encouraging this kind of behavior. And actually, Bill Maher, of all people, back in May of 2022, had a show on Real Time called Along for the Pride, where he shows the increasing number of people in the younger generations are identifying with LGBTQ, even though they're not engaged in the behavior themselves. And he says, at this rate, we'll all be gay by 2060, right? I mean, he's pointing out how the encouragement of the culture is causing people, or influencing people is a better word, to just affirm, even though they're not engaged in that culture themselves. So that's really the problem, as even an atheist like Maher admits. So I I would push back on anybody who says it's just the Christian culture suppressing it. It's also the social media culture which is encouraging it. Because what's the fastest way to feel in today, Jim, on social media is to claim you're trans. That's the fastest way for people to applaud you and for you to get a lot of attention. It's also a good way to stick it to your parents, right? Who you're trying to separate from, to claim, you're trans now. So it's more social media driven, I think, than anything else. But regardless of the cause, it's just an illogical way to look at reality, and maybe we can get into that.
Yeah, that's exactly where I want to go next. But I'll tell you that I just think this section of your book is worth the price of admission, right? In the sense that it's so current, it's so important. And what I love about your work, Frank, is, as always, is that you are right to the point and you provide kind of a quick way of thinking about this logically. And I think that comes from all the work that you're doing on university campuses. Before we go to the break, have you seen this question, this issue, change the way the Q&As occur on the campus yet? In other words, are you seeing this becoming a primary issue?
Yeah, we just had a protester at Fresno State just last week who was LGBTQ, trying to claim that, this is a right and all this. So yes, and when people ask me today, and you probably see this as well, Jim, because you're on college campuses, that when people ask what are the top 3 objections to Christianity today, I say it's morality, morality, and morality. Because this is where people are living now, and they think somehow the Christian worldview and the Christian sexual ethic is morally oppressive. Yet they have no standard by which to say their view is correct if there is no God. It's just their opinion.
Yeah, I think that I see this shifting. Tell me if you see this too, Frank, that it used to be in my generation, at least for me when I was 35, that was not a pressing issue for me. But the issue was, is it true?
Right.
And is there any evidence for this? But I think now there's 2 issues for young people. Is it true and is it good? And,
that's right.
And because it doesn't match the moral construct of the culture, this is no longer seen as good. Like this isn't good for you. So I do want to talk a little bit about why this is actually, the Christian worldview is good for you, but also there's one section of your book, and it's not a long section, but it's super helpful. And we're going to talk about that right after the break.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
What's the best explanation for moral laws?
I think all of us accept certain moral truths, and we get those from someplace. I mean, you have your own personal views on something. I've worked gangsters who had their own personal views on what was right and wrong that were very different than mine, very different than yours probably. And their gangs, a bigger group, had a certain set of laws, and if you wanted to be part of that, you took on those laws. But we all live in a city that has certain laws, and we fall underneath that. So you can get your views from people, but that's, of course, we might disagree. You can get your views from groups or governments, but governments and groups disagree. But there are some laws that transcend all of us. They really aren't grounded in individuals or groups because they transcend individuals and groups. There are some things we disagree about and some things we agree altogether. Even before there were people, we agreed probably that it was never okay to torture people for fun. You might have some sense of when it might be okay to torture people, I can't even imagine. But if you did, it was certainly never for fun. So if this rule was in place, it was in place, if this idea, this concept of morality was in place, if you believe in a Star Trek universe, that rule doesn't only apply to us as humans, it applies to every other race of aliens. It transcends not only the individual, the group, the nation, the planet, the species. Wow, where could such a transcendent, objective moral law come from? What is the authority that transcends all of this that could provide for such things? It seems to me the best and most reasonable source, grounding for those kinds of transcendent views is in a transcendent lawgiver, a transcendent source, who doesn't create these views willy-nilly. And he's not just describing views that existed before him. He's the actual source of such truth because they're simply a reflection of his divine nature. If that's the case, I think we can properly ground objective, transcendent moral values that we all agree exist, or most of us agree, especially when pushed to the example I just gave, yet we don't want to agree on how they can be grounded. Okay, now this is the part of the book that I thought was super powerful, and it's really, I don't want to say how long this part of the book is, but it's so short and punchy, so short and powerful, accessible, and it's in part 6 of your book, which is hard facts about the transgender craze. This is really the biggest area of the book that has been updated from the original book. And who would have guessed that from just 2008, or did I say 2011, let's say, to now, that we would have this much content to be updated in this book.
I know, yeah.
I mean, who would have seen that coming? Anyway, there's a part here where you talk about 5 flaws in transgender ideology, and what's so good about it is that it has nothing to do with, here's 5 ways the Bible tells you this is wrong. It's just 5 flaws in the way people think about this issue. So if you only had a few minutes, you know this is going to happen. You're so good at this, where somebody will come up to the stage at a college or university and launch this question at you, and you know you've got about 2 minutes to be able to at least address, to get the thinking started. What of these 5? Maybe you can do all of them, but people need to get the book to get all 5. What would you say are the ones that you quickly think are the major ideological flaws in transgender theory?
Yeah, probably the 2 would be, number 1, when people say that there are multiple genders, and they say that therefore there can be multiple identities. I would say, first of all, the biological world proves there's only 2 genders, because you can either produce a sperm or an egg. There's no third category. There's no, in between a sperm and an egg or something else. You're either producing a sperm or an egg. So the natural design of the body shows that there are only 2 genders, 2 sexes, and if there were more, okay, biologically you could say there are more than 2 genders, but there aren't. Now, we all know that some people can't produce either, but that's not a third capacity, that's an incapacity. So you can either produce a sperm or an egg. That would be number 1. Number 2, I would say that transgender advocates, if they're going to say there are multiple genders, in reality they have to presuppose there's only 2. Why? Because if I'm a man and I think I'm a woman, I have to have some idea what a man is and some idea what a woman is to know I have this mismatch between my psychology and my biology. If I couldn't know what a man or a woman was, transgenderism would be impossible, or gender dysphoria would be impossible. Secondly, if I try and make the transition from being a man to being a woman, which is biologically impossible, but nevertheless, if I try and do it, I again have to know what a man is and what a woman is to try and make that so-called transition. Again, if those 2 genders weren't known and couldn't be and weren't fixed, there'd be no way to try and even know about transgenderism or try and make the so-called transition. So those are the 2 of the 5 that I think you can point out very quickly that transgenderism ideologically just doesn't work. And by the way, as you may know, Jim, the so-called LGBT community is not a community much anymore, because if the T's get their way, that there are no fixed genders, the L's, the G's, and the B's don't exist. Because how can you be lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or even heterosexual for that matter, if there aren't fixed genders? Those identities presuppose fixed genders. So there's a bit of a war going on inside that community. And by the way, as you know, the feminists aren't happy either. Because if the T's get their way, there are no women. And if there are no women, there are no women's rights. So that's why people who are probably not evangelical Christians, people like J.K. Rowling, who wrote the whole Harry Potter series, despite the fact she's politically liberal, she's standing firm and saying, you're erasing women by this transgender ideology. And if you're erasing women, there are no women's rights. Stop it. And of course, even people in her movies are coming out against her, even though she's making perfect logical sense. They're just calling her names, which, as you know, is normally the MO when you don't have an argument. You'll just call, oh, you're a transphobe, or you're a bigot, or something. And as we know from our friend Greg Kokel, when they call you those names, you just got to stop and say, what do you mean by bigotry? What do you mean by transphobe? Explain yourself.
Yeah, no, this is good. I think part of it too, and this is where I've kind of worked back and forth with folks on this issue. They'll talk about, well, no, you're using the word male and female, or you're describing sex, the sex of a being, not the gender of a being. In other words, this was something for people who are listening who are maybe closer to my age, as a boomer, okay? And we're about the same age, I think, aren't we, Frank?
Yeah, you're 6 months older than me.
Oh, I'm the old man.
You're the old man,
listen,
right?
Neither one of us is even close to Greg Kokel.
No.
So that's good. We can at least...
I hope he's watching, Greg.
Yeah, take solace in that issue.
That's
right.
Right.
He's the old man. So, but okay, so I would say that a lot of folks, on my birth certificate, under the biological sex category, the title says gender. And that's a word that's been co-opted now by the ideology. And I'm actually okay with allowing that to happen. If gender is simply your perception, fine. But do we have a category anymore that describes biological sex? Now, what I think I see happening is that folks with gender ideology, they have started to take over and said, no, there's no difference. There's no distinction between gender and sex. They're to be considered the same way. And that's where I think it gets weird, right?
Yeah,
because
of course.
How do I identify whether this DNA is a male suspect or a female suspect if there isn't a distinction categorically in the biology of male and female? But when we say, hey, there's only two genders, well, they're saying, well, gender is not your biological. It used to say this. Maybe this is changing now. Do you think it is changing now that they're not saying anymore that there's even a biological difference?
Here's the incoherence again that comes through. If they're going to say that gender and biology are the same thing, okay, fine, we can agree with them. But if they're going to say gender is different completely, then why are they always trying to say that we need to change the body to match up to the gender? In other words, why are they always trying to drag the biology along with the gender? If they were two completely different things, nobody would try and get sex change operations. But they're trying to say they're completely different, but we've got to make sure that now the biology aligns with the gender. So they can't have it both ways. That's part of the problem.
You often say that transitioning just makes matters worse. And I've heard you say this both in talks, but it's also part of your book. It's one of the chapters in your book.
Yeah.
How do you, when you say that, I mean, it sounds like the other side could easily, obviously they're going to want clarification on this. What do you mean when you say something like that?
Well, what I mean is when you look at the data, about 10 years after people have this so-called surgery, by the way, there's no protocol for it because there's no way to change someone's biology. In fact, Chloe Cole, who was a 15-year-old girl out there in California, had her breasts removed. And then when she hit 18, she basically said, "What did you do to me? This is Nazi-like experimentation you've done on me." Now she's suing her doctors because she couldn't give informed consent at 15. And this is why, by the way, the gender clinics in the UK are closing now. They were 5 or 10 years ahead of America. And the people, the young people, the children that they did this on are now grown into adults and they're mortified as to what happened to them. And so they're suing the clinics and now the clinics are closing. So that's part of the problem. But when you look 10 years down the road after people have had this so-called surgery, their suicide rate, Jim, is 19 times higher than the general public. So it doesn't solve the suicide problem. In fact, the suicide problem appears to be worse after the surgery rather than before. And 63% of people that have so-called gender dysphoria have some other mental health condition. In fact, Chloe Cole was diagnosed with autism after they cut her breast off. Nobody bothered to look at this. And what she says is the girls that she's with in her high school growing up, all the ones that claimed to be trans had some other dramatic problem in their life. They had trauma at home, they were sexually abused, they had autism, they had depression, they had some mental health condition. This is a mental health condition that you do not fix with surgery. You fix with psychiatry, counseling, prayer, those kind of things. And the problem is the medical establishment sees dollar signs come up when they try and transition someone. That's the first dollar they make. And the second series of dollars they make is they put these kids on a lifetime of hormones because they have to continually direct their body in a direction it was not designed to go. So this is a big money maker for this. And I point out in the book, Correct Not Politically Correct, that people that have gone through this have figured this out and they're going, man, I got duped into this and I would never try and transition again. A, it doesn't work. B, it's put me in a very medically compromised position. It's put me in a romantically compromised position. It's made life so much more difficult for me. Now, you will find some people that, okay, it helps solve their problem, they think, but the vast majority, it's not the case.
All right, so why do you think, and this is, okay, so we have a few minutes left here, and I want to cover like why you think that for the most part, churches, Christians, were largely silent on this issue. I've often even said, I'm trying to figure out like what lane does a cold case detective have on some, not just this issue, but a number of issues where I feel like I don't think my skill set really does much to advance the cause. If I was a biologist, maybe, or if I was a doctor, maybe, but I don't. That's a problem. To take that attitude often will inhibit us from saying anything.
That's right.
So if you had some advice that you could give parents, grandparents, and just Christians in the church about how they might do something, that's the question. Is there anything we can do? If there isn't anything we can do, why are we talking about it? So what could we do?
I talk a lot about it in the book, but a couple of things we can start doing is asking questions. And I know people say stay in your lane, but as Christians, the entire road is ours. If we see people being hurt, we have to speak up, even if we're not experts in the area, right? So we have to speak up when we see kids being transitioned when you can't transition, you can't change your biology. You can change your mind, you can't change your biology. For example, we would never say to an anorexic, you're right, you're too fat, let me give you a liposuction. We would say, honey, your mind's playing tricks on you, let me get you psychiatry. We wouldn't give that person surgery or liposuction. We would never say to our daughters, if your daughter came to you and said, hey, Dad, I'm a mermaid, we wouldn't take her off the coast and drop her in the ocean, right? We would say, honey, your mind's playing tricks on you. So we have to start asking questions. In just a couple of minutes, let me just mention a couple of things we can do. Suppose your kid comes to you and say, Mom, Dad, I'm trans. Number one, don't freak out. Okay, you can't freak out. They're never going to come to you again if you freak out over these issues. Then you got to ask questions. First of all, thank you for telling me. When did you start feeling this way? What do you mean by trans? Do feelings always tell you the truth? Because a lot of times they don't, right? Do your feelings ever change? Well, yours have. Last month you weren't trans, now you are trans. What changed? You think your feelings might change again? In fact, 80% of kids, Jim, who have this so-called gender dysphoria, grow out of it by the time they're 18. So it makes no sense to try and transition anyone, even if transition could work. It doesn't work. And then you might ask them, have you looked into the medical effects of trying to do this? Because I guarantee you they haven't. If they look into it, they're going to be mortified just like everybody else. So ask a lot of questions. What do you mean by trans? Do feelings always tell you the truth? Do your feelings ever change? They're going to change. And this is not the right way forward if you look at the evidence.
So, Frank, this is a book that has been out for a while. This is an update. I kind of feel like in many ways this is kind of an important relaunch because it's really covering issues that are so current. And it's covering them in a way that people can actually use, accessible, and can do something immediately. So where do you want them to go to get the book?
Well, they can go to Amazon and get it, or they can go to crossexamined.org, click on store. You can find it there. We may have it a little cheaper than Amazon. But yeah, it's called Correct Not Politically Correct, about same-sex marriage and transgenderism. As I say, there's not a Bible verse in it. I'd quote one Bible verse, and that is Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart because everything you do flows from it. That's the only Bible verse in it. It's not a biblical case. Well, it is a biblical case without using the Bible. Let's put it that way. It's a natural law case. Yeah.
So let me ask you: are you surprised that we can even still sell this book at Amazon?
Yeah. Well, maybe they put it in the fiction section.
No, you liar.
Yeah, but it's selling, man. It's been selling very well, and I'm kind of surprised. But people
are you serious about the fit? You're kidding.
Yeah. If you find it, you'll see it.
Oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah,
okay. That is so interesting. Okay, so folks, get over to Amazon and make a mockery of where they put that. What category they put that in.
Put a good review up there, will you? Yeah.
That's right. And cross-examined with a D at the end.
That's right.
.org is where you can find all things Frank Turek and a bunch of other apologists who serve there too. So, Frank, thanks so much for coming on our show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Jim. You're wonderful. Great being with you. And folks, get the new Cold Case Christianity too. The new update. It's great.
Thanks, brother.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.